All right. So today I'd like to talk briefly about social class systems under capitalism. So we want to look at stratification, but we also want to understand then that the stratified layers that make up a stratification system have their origins in the operations of a society's economic systems. So when we look at industrial society, so basically everything after the end of feudalism and the estate system, which characterizes significant portions of the world, especially Europe, up until about the 15 or 1600s, we see the emergence of what are called social class systems. So social class systems replace the relatively rigidly organized stratification system that existed before that. So under feudalism, you've got what is essentially a kind of caste system in which people are born into social positions. If you are born to parents who are peasants, you are going to be a peasant. If you are born to to parents who are members of the nobility, you're going to be a member of the nobility, right? So, um, um, a little bit different than a caste system. It's something we call the estate system. But it's essentially a very rigid, closed system in which people don't really get to move from position to position the way that people, at least in principle, are able to move, or at least permitted to move, once that old system gets replaced by systems that are being organized under capitalism. So a social class system is a system of stratification that's believed to be open and not based on hereditary factors. And the criteria for one's position in this social class system, at least conventionally speaking, is a function of your socioeconomic status, or sometimes what we call SES, which is a lot easier to say than socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is essentially a measure of three things: your income, your wealth, and the occupational prestige that your job is sort of held in. So what society thinks of what you do for a living. Income and wealth, I think, should be fairly straightforward, right? How much you earn and how much, what's the total value of all the stuff you own. So you put those three things together: income, wealth, occupational prestige, and you get something we call socioeconomic status. The highest level of socioeconomic status would be the upper class. The next level down would be the middle class, then the working class, and then the lower class. So in this particular model of industrial stratification, a social class, and we'll just call this a conventional understanding of social class, a social class is a group of people who share a similar SES, a similar economic position within society. Most Americans, when they think about social class, probably think about this. They think about upper class, middle class, working class, lower class. There are other ways to look at one's position within society, and we're going to look at one of those in just a moment. But this one is probably most familiar to the greatest number of you, and it's important, right? It's a very, very useful sort of way of looking at social class in a society. The upper class is going to be a really small group of people. They have a lot of income and a lot of wealth and a lot of prestige, but they are a really, really small group of people. And that's going to be an issue in a society like the United States that is, about 71% of all economic activity in the United States is consumer spending. So the driver of economic activity in the United States isn't this tiny little group of people at the top. It's actually the middle class. The middle class is large, and they have discretionary income, which means that after they pay their bills, after they pay the things they're obligated to pay, their mortgage or their rent payment, they pay their bills, they buy their groceries, they're going to have money left over, and they're going to go out then and spend that money. They're going to take vacations, they're going to buy new cars, they're going to go to movies, and they're going to go to shows, and they're going to go out to restaurants and all of that. And so we find that the middle class is the driver of culture, and it's the driver of economic activity because it is the primary marketplace for the goods and services that are being produced by businesses, by corporations and firms. So while the upper class has more money than the middle class, there aren't enough of them to drive an entire economy. They're not, a rich person might buy a few houses, but one rich person isn't going to buy, 350 houses because, that's, maybe that's the ratio of rich people to middle class people, one for every 350 or something. I'm making that up. I don't know the exact number, but you see my point, right? The middle class, because it's large, is going to be the driver of the economy, not the upper class. Upper class has way more money, but far, far fewer numbers. So that's why this is important, right? When we see the middle class robust, when we see the middle class large and healthy with a lot of discretionary income, we see prosperity. We see economic times that are good in the country, and good for lots of people, right? Good for capitalists, good for the middle class, of course, because their quality of life and their standard of living is quite good, but also for the working class, and even in some regards the lower class, the working class, of course, because there are going to be a lot of employment opportunities selling products and services to the middle class that are being produced by members of the upper class, but also the lower class, which might be much more dependent on things like transfer payments and government programs. Those transfer programs and transfer payments and government programs are going to be more robust because the tax base will be larger, and the government will have the resources and revenue necessary to improve the quality of life, even of those people at the very, very bottom. Now, the working class is also quite large, but the problem, of course, is, or the difference, I should say, is that the working class will have less discretionary income after it pays its bills, its essential bills. So when it comes to driving the economy, of course, the working class is going to have less influence, less sway. Generally speaking, the primary divide between the the middle class and the working class seems to be one of occupation, whether the occupation you work in requires credentialing and professional sort of skills versus people who work in retail, people who work in hospitality, food service, sometimes factories. There are working class people who make very, very substantial incomes. Think of like specialized trades like electricians and plumbers and things like that. But generally speaking, as I said, the distinction comes down to essentially whether one is white collar or blue collar, right? A white collar job is a job that you work and you don't get dirty. A blue collar job, of course, is a job where you're going to be working more with your hands, or you're going to be doing something a little bit more manual. So the middle class and the working class both need to be large, both need to be healthy, but it's really the middle class that's going to be the driver there. And when we've seen economic decline in the United States, it has often been correlated with a weakening of the middle class, either in terms of its earnings and thus its purchasing power, or its relative size. And that's always something to keep in mind. The other way to look at social class in industrial stratification systems is through a kind of critical conflict lens. Critical conflict lens, not surprisingly, draws a lot on the work of people like Marx and others kind of working in that tradition, in which your class position is a function of your relationship to the means of production, to the relations of production. So in a classic Marxian formula, there are really only two classes of people, right? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers, people who purchase the labor power of others in order to produce goods and services, which are then sold for a profit, capitalists, or the people who sell their labor power to those people, the workers. And the workers can be people who are paid quite a lot of money for their labor, or very little for their labor. And I think sometimes when we focus on just income and wealth, we often miss out on the nature of what a person is doing in the economy. If you're selling your labor power to a capitalist or a capitalist firm, you're a worker. It doesn't matter if you're making $350,000 a year. Good for you, right? That's a decent amount of money to earn in a year. But you're still selling your labor power. And at the end of the day, your economic fortunes are a function of whether or not somebody wants to purchase or needs to purchase your labor power. You don't actually have any control over the operation of the economy. you are in a much better position to go out and be a consumer, but you're not actually making economic decisions. The capitalist class, that's the group of people who are making those decisions because they own the relations of production. They own factories, they own raw materials, they own distribution networks, they own companies and firms, and owning those things gives you tremendous power. And that's what this particular way of looking at social class captures. That a conventional way of looking at social class as a function of socioeconomic status overlooks, which is the role of power. Power isn't the same thing as income or wealth. Now, if you have a lot of power, the chances are very good that you're going to have high levels of income and wealth. But having high levels of income and wealth don't automatically translate into power. Power here being control over economic decision making. Right? If I have a CEO and he's making $3.5 million a year running my factory, but I decide as the owner of that factory that I'm going to close it down or I'm going to move it from the United States to someplace else in the world where labor costs are much lower, the CEO can't stop me. It's my company. I get to do that, right? Because it's about ownership, right? Ownership gives me that power. So the capitalist class is always going to be the most powerful class. The workers are going to have varying levels of power, right? So it isn't just, it isn't fair to lump them all into one category. On some level, it isn't fair to lump them all into one category and just say they're powerless. A member of the workers could have a great deal of power if I hire, as a capitalist, if I hire a CEO to run my company, I'm vesting that person with particular authority and power to make decisions, right? Hiring and firing, product line development, marketing, things like that. I can put that into the hands of that person. But that person doesn't have that power. The position has been kind of imbued with that power, and whoever occupies that position can then exercise that power. But as the owner of the company, I have the final say in both who does that work, but also what the nature of that work would be. So sometimes you'll see a critical conflict analysis of social class in which they talk about capitalists on the top and blue collar and white collar workers on the bottom, but then they carve out sort of special recognition or special attention for things like managers. Managers are a special class of worker who are, granted power, but again, granted power is a function of the position they occupy, not that's their power. It's power that's been delegated to them. Or even entrepreneurs, like an entrepreneur, like somebody who writes or somebody who creates music, they don't really have power per se. What they tend to have is autonomy, right? They tend to have the ability to set the times and dates and other conditions under which they do work. But if you're a musician and you're creating songs and compositions that you would like to sell to consumers so that you can support yourself, you're going to need somebody who can market your album, who can put it into vinyl and CDs and digital formats, and that means you need a capitalist. So entrepreneurs and managers kind of have a little bit of a different sort of work experience than, say white collar and blue collar workers. But at the end of the day, Marx would probably still argue that they're all in the same class because these are people who are selling their labor power as opposed to people who are purchasing the labor power of others. And that is the major distinction when it comes to power, right? Do you have authority over making economic decisions or not? And if the answer is yes, then you're a capitalist. And if the answer is no, you're a worker. And that's a very different sort of analysis than upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class, but no less important. And I think the two kind of nicely go hand in hand. And so I encourage everyone to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at the operation of an economic system like the United States. Understand that income, wealth, and prestige are important, but power is also important. And if we don't pay attention to both of those things, we're going to have an incomplete picture of what social class looks like in the U.S. All right, so until next time, take care.